The Kingdom of Heaven Taken by Prayer by William Huntington, number 2. I settle at Mortlake. After many rambling about the country, I went and settled at last at Mortlake in Surrey, where the effectual work of drawing me from the world began to operate on my soul. I had lost my child by sudden death, as is related in the Bank of Faith. My wife went to nurse a lying-in woman in Barnes, at a little distance from Mortlake, and during her stay at the place, I was left entirely alone, both at my work and at home. As I was one day at my labour, I was reflecting on my many sicknesses, soul troubles, extreme poverty and disappointments, which I had met with in the course of my life. I considered the poor, tried, troubled state I was then in, together with the loss of my child and my being almost an utter stranger in a strange place. And on a proper view of the whole, I murmured and fretted at my hard fate, and thought I might adopt the language of good old Job and say, "Few and evil have been my days." But suddenly I was impressed with power on my mind that all these evils were brought upon me for my sin, and that I neither knew, feared, loved, nor served God as I ought to do, and therefore had brought these trials on myself. And it was a great mercy God didn't take me instead of the infant. The impression was attended with an uncommon flow of contrition, inasmuch that I was at times overwhelmed with a sorrowful spirit, and so dissolved in my meekness that I went weeping and mourning all the day long until my soul was as a weaned child. This frame of spirit was attended chiefly with self-pity, because I had, by sin, exposed myself to so many hardships in this life, and for aught I knew, to more in the next. I was, however, at times a little tinctured with godly sorrow to think I had so much offended the Almighty, and this was accompanied with a fear that he would not be pacified toward me. Under these workings of mind, I began secretly to call on the name of the Lord in prayer and embrace every opportunity that offered itself. My petitions were such as I had learned out of books, and some expressions of my own which I used in confession, as no form seemed to be sufficient to suit the complicated diseases of my mind. This heavy, gloomy frame of soul was attended with a twofold blessing, for in my heart, being pregnant with compunction drove me perpetually to God in prayer, and in pouring out my soul before God, I found I had ease in my mind until I got under a fresh reflection of past offences and a future view of the effects as the just rewards of sin. Then my heart conceived again her fresh burden, and I evidently found that there was no release to be had but on my knees before God, where I could speak and so as to be eased. The other blessing that attended me under this oppression of soul was that it weaned me from company. I was naturally and cheerfully disposed, which enlarged me in the company of many acquaintances. But when I began to be a little habituated to these gloomy regions of death, I found that all my anxiety after, love to, and delight in company was quite blasted, so that my spirit withered like a green herb in all the joys of mortals. Rural retirement seemed most agreeable to me, as it best suited my bewildered state of mind, till at length I began to detest all company and fly from all my acquaintances. I dwelt like a sparrow alone on the housetops, or like a pelican in the wilderness, or an owl of the desert. Finding my spirit dead to all society, and no ease to my soul but on my knees before God in private, I earnestly solicited the Almighty to keep me from all fellowship with the wicked, having, as I thought, accumulated guilt enough already. In answer to this, it was suggested, as a voice to my best attention, that I must quit the place in which I dwelt, with all my companions, and never more have fellowship with any worldly company whatsoever. This impression sunk so deep on my mind that it never could be erased by all the frowns or smiles of the children of men, nor do I believe it ever will. Under this impulse, I went to Barnes to inform my wife of my determination of leaving the place and forsaking all my companions, and that forever. And I gave her several reasons for this in my determination, but concealed the worst of the matter. Her answer was, "Do just as you will. I'm ready to go with you to any place you choose." I've often since thought of good old Jacob, sending for Rachel and Leah into the field to him to inform them of their father's conduct towards him, and of God's vision that was open to him, and of the Lord's commanding him to return to his own country, whose submissive answers were, "Now then, whatsoever God hath said unto thee," a sweet submissive reply, well becoming a pious helpmeet. I now watched the hand of God to see if an opportunity offered for my departure, but every door seemed for a time to be shut. However, I kept close to my church, endeavoured to shun all company, embraced every opportunity that offered itself to pour out my soul in prayer and to show God my trouble. Psalm 143, verse 2. Nor did the deep concern I was under in the least abate, but heaven is a spirit, meekness and humbling sorrow perpetually pursued me, and my mind was immersed in the meditations of futurity. After my wife had returned from her nursery, she had an awful dream, which in the morning she related to me. It was this, that the devil had appeared to her in her sleep, with a most formidable aspect, and was going to lay hold of her, but she cried out, and he immediately left her, and made a violent seizure upon me. I had not at that time told her of my distress of mind, therefore she knew not how much the narrative of her dream contributed to the anguish of my spirit. I laid her words up and pondered them over my heart, and as I believe her to be a very pious soul, I was fully persuaded I should ere long feel the effect of her dreadful vision, which God knows I soon did, as my reader will observe in the sequel. I had no thoughts of a violent temptation by divine permission assailing me that should strip me of fleshly confidence, but what I expected was that death, judgment and eternal damnation would be the dreadful result of her dream. Finding fresh troubles increased daily upon me, I longed to get out of the place I was in, fearing that my companions would sometime or other entangle me and get me out of a pleasure-taking on the Lord's day, for as I found by my power against sin was little worth, I wanted to shun even the appearance of temptation. I went over to Mr. Lowes, a nurseryman at Hampton Wick, and asked him to employ me, which he accordingly did. It was now late in the autumn, but he promised to employ me till he could provide for me in another way. I endeavoured to get ready furnished lodgings in Kingston, but could not. I was therefore determined to walk to and fro from Kingston to Mortlake every day, rather than stay in that place, where I had contracted an intimacy with several persons whose company I didn't relish. I continued in this situation for about a fortnight, but at length got a lodging in Kingston. I was now determined never to get acquainted with any person unless he seemed to be religious, and being in a strange place where I was not known, I had not so many temptations to draw me into company. I now took to reading any book that I could get, kept close to the church, kept up private and family prayer with my wife, and laboured to recommend myself to the favour of God. I learned several little short prayers to repeat on the road as I walked, or at my labour, or on my bed, which I judged was redeeming lost time. However, I had one great difficulty to grapple with, which was we were obliged to go to a public house on the Saturday evening to receive our wages, where each labourer was compelled to spend 4 pence. This I could not avoid, though I found it a snare to me, because I was compelled to wait till the foreman had paid me, which sometimes would be as late as 8 or 9 o'clock. During this time I was obliged to hear all the songs that were sung and all the filthy conversation. This, I found, scattered all my religious thoughts and made many breaches in my poor false peace, which I had been patched up with by the mere dint of hard labour. However, to close up these gaps, I generally worked the harder, said more prayers, read more, and got up earlier in the morning in order to perform a greater task. And so, by this means, I pacified conscience with a double portion of dead works. Hebrews 9, verse 14. My fellow workmen perceived me to sit silent at the pay table, while they were jovial, and finding that I would not join in with them with liquor when at work, they suspected I'd caught a religious infection. Upon this, I was set up as a butt for laughter and ridicule, and my bringing forth now and then a passage of Scripture to show the end they were likely to make if they died in their sins, as they then lived in, this gave great offence, and exposed my head as a mark for every scorner upon which to spend his shafts. This I laboured under for the space of many months. For a while they suspect me to be a Methodist, but, finding I never went to the meeting, and that, in every argument with them, I pleaded for the church, their suspicion was that I wanted to be better than other people and to be more religious than was required of those who belonged to the Church of England. Having, as I thought, patched up a tolerable religion and redeemed a deal of lost time by labour, I began to be lifted up in my own mind and to be filled with a vain conceit of my own righteousness, finding my zeal and diligence to continue, and from my being now habituated to this religious course of life, I began to have a very high opinion of my religion, and to judge myself righteous and others. Indeed, the language of my heart to most people was, "Stand by thyself, come not near unto me, for I am holier than thou." Isaiah 45:5. However, God permitted me to make several private slips in this my religious way of life, which brought fresh guilt on my conscience. This sting induced me to examine a little of the root of my religion, and I found that I had no love to God in it, but that it was merely to pacify my conscience, escape the torments of hell, and to appear righteous before men. While I was perplexed with these thoughts, this was secretly suggested to my mind. Suppose you could continue this course of religion till the time of your death, you can only rub off as you go, and hardly that, for you offend daily in thought, word, and deed. And what is to become of all that black scroll that's behind you? I found that the more I meditated on these things, the deeper I sank in distress. Therefore I tried to cast it from me, not liking to come to book. This put me a little out of conceit with my own righteousness. I thought there was something yet wanting in my head, and conscience lashed me within for a few offences, as well as for present blots, stopped me from boasting, and showed me a little of the hypocrisy of my own heart. God beholds the proud afar off, and those that walk in pride he is able to debase. Daniel 4:37.